While retirement is generally seen as a time of relaxation and self-focus, God calls us to love, serve, and help others for a lifetime. He has been preparing us for this retirement season, literally our entire lives. In retirement, countless Christians enter a state of spiritual dormancy, not knowing how they are called to have an impact for God's kingdom. The Retirement Reformation seeks to encourage and empower the 50 million Christians approaching or in retirement to embrace the calling God has been preparing in them. When the world says it's time to stop, you can begin to have your greatest impact. Welcome to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, where our goal is to journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him.
Reaching out to the 50 million Christ followers in America who are approaching or already in retirement, you've tuned into iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, along with the founder of the Retirement Reformation, Bruce Prynsma. Check us out online, retirementreformation.org, retirementreformation.org. You know, culture shapes the way we think. 30, 40, 50 years ago, when you were contemplating retirement, you lived in a quiet neighborhood, had a couple of nice neighbors, and life was fairly chill. Almost everyone around you lived just like you, and almost all of society was shaped by biblical morality. Fast forward to today, where over 80% of the population doesn't even go to church. Back when you started thinking about retirement, $1 million was a lot of money. Now the average American house, the purchase of a house in America costs over $500,000. Life has changed, to put it simply. How has all that impacted the way you view your retirement and your future? The next 3 podcasts are dedicated to evaluating how the culture impacts you and how you can impact the culture. As always, Bruce Prynsma is here to join us. Bruce is the founder of the Retirement Reformation and my co-host on iRetire4Him. Bruce, welcome back to iRetire4Him.
Always good to be here and to speaking to our audience on subjects that they may have been wondering about, and perhaps we can be of some help.
Yeah, I'm hoping. And this conversation about culture is such a powerful one because the culture, in my perspective, is kind of a mess. So, Bruce, start off with, why did you develop the Retirement Reformation?
Well, the Retirement Reformation was really a response to 2 changes. One was cultural, and we'll be talking about that in this podcast and the next couple, but also just the reality that life is longer now, and so we have 30 years. So there's a greater opportunity for confusion. There's a greater opportunity for pain. There's a greater opportunity for frustration. There's a greater opportunity for all those negative things. But on the flip side, there is the greater opportunity to build the kingdom and to be able to take the resources that God has built into each one of us and apply those in kingdom ways. However, that having been said, that 30 years and the change in culture that you were reflecting means that it is often a much more confusing and difficult task than it's ever been before.
I mean, can you imagine your parents and my grandparents in today's society? I mean, they'd be rolling their eyes, they'd be upset, they'd be frustrated. They might not talk about it, but I mean, life has changed a lot. I mean, Bruce, just from your own personal perspective, how has your perspective on retirement changed over the last 30, 40, 50 years?
Well, you know, when I was growing up, just again, that timeline is that, you know, you retire at 65 and you die at 67. And if you made it to 70, you were really old. Now 70, hey, that's still young and growing. So my own personal observation and experience in retirement, I just turned 80. And so I was praying the other day and talking to God and saying, what kind of a time frame should I be thinking about? And, you know, how long is this going to go on? And the answer I got was, 104, so 24 more years. So here I am at 80 with 24 more years. Boy, if that doesn't change your perspective, I don't know what does. And so in that 30-year period, let's call that for most of us, there's going to be a series of new challenges. And so being being able to adjust, accept, and embrace change is probably the single biggest category that ways that it has affected me, and I think it affects most people.
Did you ever imagine, though, that culture would be so radically different than when you were growing up? I mean, the average, household after World War II had a husband and a wife and a couple of kids, and they lived in a cute little house that was about 1,000 square feet. They had maybe one car. They maybe had a TV in the 50s. I mean, the world today is just so different. And back then, people still lived according to the golden rule. That was, and when you shook hands on a deal, it meant something. I mean, did you ever imagine it would be so different today?
Well, I think Judy's in my life is perhaps reflective of that, and I think yours too. But someone was asking me the other day, and when they were visiting us in our home, and they said, "Well, how many places have you lived?" And I said, "This is our 19th home. Our 19th home." Growing up, generally you stayed in the neighborhood where you were, and the people that you knew when you were growing up, or the people you went to school with, were the people that you knew when you were older. That is no longer the case. I have an example of a very good friend. They lived here in Colorado Springs for the last 16 years. She developed some physical problems. They then moved within a week's period of time to New Hampshire to be near their kids. And 2 weeks after they got there, he died.
Oh my.
So think of all the complexity that is involved in the decision to move, the actually doing it. Now she's in a place where she really doesn't know anybody. Her husband's passed away. And so, people have an idea that retirement is really a simple and relaxed period of time. I'm here to tell you that it is probably more complex and has the potential of creating more stress than perhaps any other time, but it also is an opportunity when we can have the most impact if we're connected to what God's plan for our life is. We step into that and we're moving forward with it. We can talk some more about that, what that looks like in our culture of today.
Yeah, and that impact is what iRetire4Him is all about in the conversations that we have. And of course, it's what all of your Retirement Reformation materials are all about, is how do we make an impact, and what does that impact look like? And we've both written about it, and that's something that's so powerful. But it goes down to the point, I'm sorry to hear about your friends, but moving is hard. And a lot of us I've talked with both my parents and Martha's parents about moving to be closer to us, and Martha's parents opted not to, and my parents are in Arizona, they opted not to. But hearing this, that's not the first time I've heard that people moved across the country and all of a sudden, then one of them dies. It's stressful to move and to give up everything you know. That's a stressful deal.
Absolutely, it is. Matter of fact, in our life group yesterday, we called the spouse, the wife, and had a conversation with her. And there's so much tension involved in relating to our current culture. Here she is. She's glad she's there with her parent. On the other hand, she doesn't have a church. She doesn't know where to go. She hasn't met friends. And so she was missing the community that we had here. And it's a what's the word I'm looking for? It's a time of tension, a time of frustration, while we are in fact navigating through these complex issues that 30 years has created for us.
Bruce, what about the financial reality of culture and how that's changed over the years? If people retired the way they lived back in the 50s and the 60s, that'd be a whole lot different than retiring the way we live today. People used to have $20,000, $15,000, $5,000 mortgages. Now today, people have $500,000 mortgages. The financial reality is also a cultural issue, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it adds significant stress because just simply by the fact that we are living longer, 30 years, in fact, your savings need to be of sufficient amount to be able to support that length of time and the 3 different stages of retirement that there are. As a matter of fact, I was reading some stats the other day that over 80% of our medical expenses in our national health system are spent on people in their last 3 or 4 years of life. And so it's a challenging time. The government doesn't really know what to do and how to handle it. We're not sure what to do and how to handle it. And the confusion about Medicaid, and Social Security, and then the issues of family and location. So, I know 6 or 7 families that have moved from Colorado Springs back to the Midwest and different areas where they were from, not because of financial issues, although that was part of it, but was also the fact that their lungs couldn't handle the air here. And so all of a sudden, these physical issues and the costs associated with them play out. Our pastor had 2 sons-in-law, and both of their mothers died of COVID in the last 3 months. So now what do they do, and how do they do it? What I don't want to do here is paint a negative picture, but I think we do have to understand what is true, and then how God will lead us, and what are the steps that we're going to take during these very complex times, and the whole new roles and challenges that our culture brings to us.
Well, and I think when we come back, after we have our middle segment with Larry Fowler, I want to come back and let's have some of those conversations. Let's really talk about the conversations we need to have and how we can impact culture. Because I really think that's what the Retirement Reformation is all about. Not only do we want to reform our thinking about how retirement goes, but how do we change the cultural conversations? Do we, as the wealthiest generation in the United States of America, still have influential power? We're talking with Bruce Brynsby today from the Retirement Reformation. Please check him out online, retirementreformation.org. You're listening to iRetire4Him, and we'll be right back.
The Retirement Reformation wants to come alongside you as you navigate in each stage of your retirement. Our online resources include our blog, our downloadable books, and life planning studies, as well as membership and coaching options. Go to retirementreformation.org and use these resources to begin the transformation of your retirement. Journey from retirement to reformation, so you can say, I retire for Him. That's retirementreformation.org. Now, back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to iRetire4Him. Bruce, in every iRetire4Him middle segment, you always bring on an incredible guest. You've got for us today Larry Fowler with the Legacy Coalition, online at legacycoalition.com.
Larry, welcome. We're so glad to have you and to speak to our audience in all the work that you've done in grandparenting through the Legacy Coalition. It's just, you're really doing some good work, and I'm so glad that you're on. Let's just acquaint our audience a little bit with who you are and how you came to be connected with the Legacy Coalition and the Grandparenting Conference that's going to be held here in another week in Birmingham and around the country. So give us just a little bit of your history, if you would.
Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, we started the Legacy Coalition in 2016. I was 63 years old at the time and had a whole lifelong career of children's ministry, been involved in children's ministry all of my life. But God just really began to impress on us that there wasn't anybody really speaking about the grandparent role, certainly not on a national basis. And so we put together a team and started an organization in 2016 with no money and just all volunteers. But God's really favored us and blessed us since that time.
It's interesting that you approach the issues of grandparenting from the perspective of children. We know that in the older that we get, we become perhaps more like children again. So how have you found the connection between an older grandparent and now the multiple generations that have come behind, not just one generation, but multiple generations?
Well, many churches talk about multiple generations, and of course, the connection for me is that's a pattern of discipleship that the Bible talks about. The verse that really changed my wife and I was Deuteronomy 4:9, the last phrase of it, where it says, "Teach your children and your children's children." And I I think I'd read that verse many times, but I saw it with new eyes one day, and I understood that as a grandparent, that I had a responsibility before God still within my family. And my responsibility was to be an additional teacher to my grandchildren about the things of God. And so, our grandparenting ministry is children's ministry. So for me, it was a real good connection because we're still all about helping children and young people grow up to follow the Lord.
With the changes in our culture, with the increased use of technology, with the cultural fact that often we are geographically separated from our grandchildren or children from our grandparents, and that we have family that's spread around the country, not just around the block. How has both technology and the geographical distancing made the challenge that you're addressing? How have you addressed that?
Well, of course, technology has both the good and the bad in it. And one of the good things, of course, is the ability to be able to do video calls with grandkids that live at a distance, or to text them so easily. That has made communication for the grandparents so much easier. And 5 years ago when we started, there weren't a lot of grandparents or there were quite a few grandparents that would say, "Well, I don't text," or "I don't do that." But that's really changed, and so now grandparents are getting much more used to the idea of texting and video, FaceTiming and Skyping and things like that, and that really allows grandparents to still have an impact in the lives of their grandkids, even if they don't live close.
That was really one of the benefits of COVID, wasn't it?
Yeah.
That bringing grandparents and their grandchildren and the rest of their family actually in many ways closer together than when they lived in the in a nearby town. So, if you were to say one thing to our grandparent listeners here about their role and the importance of their role, how would you characterize that to encourage our audience in that role?
Well, I'd say two things. Number one, you have incredible potential to influence the youngest generations. In the United States, there are about 30 million professing Christian grandparents. They will have an average, when they're done getting grandkids, they will have an average of 6 grandkids each. Now, there's some overlap in that, but it probably means that among the grandparents of America, the Christian grandparents, we can influence 100 million of the youngest Americans. And that's pretty awesome in terms of national potential. But on the local level or on an individual level, grandparents are second only to parents in their potential to influence kids spiritually. They love them. They have a relationship with them. I mean, grandparents are ideal mentors for the youngest generations. And then besides that, as I already said, we have a scriptural responsibility to do so. The Bible says, teach your children and your children's children. So if we're going to obey scripture, we got to do it. Those are the two things I'd say.
Well, thank you for that. And if one of our listeners wants to really embrace that subject and find some guidance and some tools, can they find that at your website?
Yes. Yeah, we have lots of tools on our website. It's legacycoalition.com. We have free webinars every Monday night, but they can be viewed after the fact. We have that. We have podcasts on grandparenting, and then we have a national conference on grandparenting that's coming up this week.
So what is your podcast called, Larry? So if people want to connect with it on Apple Podcasts, what's the podcast called?
Legacy Grandparenting.
Legacy Grandparenting is the name of the podcast. Larry, I got a question for you. All right, so I'm in my mid-50s. I've got parents, and my wife's got parents, all of them in their late 80s. How are you encouraging them? Because they're all very frustrated with the culture of today. They're frustrated because it's not the culture they grew up with. How are you encouraging people in their 80s to impact culture?
Well, we're all frustrated with culture. I certainly would agree with that, and not only just frustrated but shocked. But just because culture has changed so much doesn't mean that we can't have a huge impact on the younger generations. And we'll give them all sorts of practical ideas about what to do, but the primary thing is to lean into the relationships with your grandchildren, even if they're young adults, even if they're in their 30s or 40s, and you're in your 80s, you still can have an impact through a relationship with those that are in younger generations in your family.
Well, I think there's such wisdom there because our God is a God of relationship. And as he designed the church, is to be a church of relationships with every different roles, and then to be able to carry that forth from generation to generation. That's really encouraging. Thank you, Larry, and I really appreciate that.
I got one more question for you, Larry, before we let you go. Okay, a lot of grandparents get separated from their grandkids because of divorce. Because family gets spread out all over the country, and divorce just tends to alienate relationships. How are you helping grandparents to be influencers, whether maybe they can't do it with their own grandkids, but maybe they can do it with neighbors' kids? I mean, how are you helping them overcome this whole divorce plague?
Well, of course, divorce. Yeah, you're right. Divorce is a huge issue, but it's not just divorce. I mean, it could be just broken relationships within the family, apart from divorce. When people just don't get along, and the hurdle of a broken relationship, whether by divorce or by something else, is one of the most difficult hurdles there is. But that doesn't mean there's no hope for impact in the lives of grandkids. So we have sessions we've written. I've written a book on it entitled "Overcoming Grandparenting Barriers," and one whole part in that, 1/3 of that book, is on the topic of what to do when there's a broken relationship. And it means taking a new strategy, a completely new approach. And to just be real quick for you guys, the new approach is to follow what Jesus did when he dealt with difficult situations. He almost always approached it from a position of grace. And so we talk about that, about how that looks like, how it looks, and what you can do in the face of a divorce or other kinds of broken relationships in order to still have an impact on your grandkids.
What does that look like? What does a position of grace look like? What do you mean?
Well, a position of grace looks like being willing to learn. Let me give you a story real quick. A grandma came to me one time early on in our ministry and said, "Mr. Fowler, I understand what you're saying, but what do I do? Both of my kids have converted to Buddhism, and as a result, they don't want me talking to their kids about God at all." So that was a broken relationship because of a religious, spiritual decision. Well, I didn't know how to answer her very good, and about a year later, I connected with Focus on the Family, was speaking with their family ministry people, and I related that story. And I think I told the story, and then I said, I didn't know how I would answer her real good. And afterwards, one of the retired family counselors that works with Focus came up to me, and he said, "You know what I would have said?" And I was all ears because I really wanted to hear what he would have said to her. He said, "You know what I would have said? Start learning about Buddha." And I thought, wow, he wasn't saying convert to Buddhism. He was saying try to understand. And trying to understand is probably the most significant thing that you can do to show grace when somebody has a opposing view of you. Think about in politics. What if the Republicans really tried to understand the Democrats, and the Democrats really tried to understand the Republicans? What
Now
that
we
would
know.
do to
Now we know
politics.
you flipped off the deep end. You're talking about people understanding each other. I mean, it's so true, Larry. Absolutely so true.
Yeah.
All right.
And so that's the way grace shows up in the family.
Larry Fowler, LegacyCoalition.com, LegacyCoalition.com. Bruce, you got any final questions?
No, I think that's good. There's about 100 more questions we could do. I think connecting with Larry's website and the materials that they have there, just like connecting with the retirementreformation.org and the materials we have here. I think God is providing some pathways for seniors to be able to reflect Jesus in our world in ways that are redeeming and will bring hope. So Larry, thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you in Birmingham in a few days.
Yes, thank you, Larry.
Glad to be with you guys.
Yeah, we'll be right back with more on I Retire for Him.
It's time we stop looking at our retirement years as 30 years of vacation, leisure, and self-gratification. Let's take control of our retirement life plan and build meaning, purpose, and intentionality into it. Go to retirementreformation.org and click on the word manifesto. We invite you to make a retirement declaration to yourself and to God. Sign the manifesto and start changing the way you think about retirement. Retirementreformation.org. Click on Manifesto. Journey from retirement to reformation, so you can say, I retire for Him. Now let's get back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to I Retire for Him. As Bruce and I are talking about the cultural conversations, the cultural impact on retirees, the retirees' impact on culture, and really just how the culture has shifted so radically for those who are in their retirement years today. I mean, Bruce, many of the people retiring today were born in the early 60s or even late 50s, and those that are enjoying their retirement and are well established in their retirement were born in the 30s and their 40s, in the 30s and the 40s. The culture has shifted so much. Bruce, when you start talking about retirement with your friends, your family, and when the first time you start talking about culture, let me just rephrase that question. When you first started talking about retirement, you and Judy, and you look at the culture then versus the culture today, did you ever imagine that the culture would be influencing people in such a different way today?
One of the biggest things, I always thought that the church and the Christian community would be the leading driver of culture and cultural change. In fact, it has shifted so dramatically that what culture is saying now to those Christ followers and to the church, we don't really want to hear from you, and we don't believe that your input is relevant. Wow, that fact, that change is such a dramatic repositioning of who we are in relation to our culture. And so that the culture is leading us rather than us impacting culture. How do you impact culture? Well, first of all, you got to be relevant. Relevant means that you have to have an understanding of what are the issues that our culture is really grappling with and how can we connect with them. So, for example, I'll just pick an easy one. Jobs are an important issue today. Jobs not only for younger people, but jobs for those, maybe it's a second career job or a third career job. Many people are going back to work not because they have to, but because they're bored if they don't. They can't find meaning. So now they're going back. So this whole issue of jobs is really a critical one. Ask yourself this question. What role is the church playing in either preparing people for new jobs, helping them to find ones existing they have, or showing them how to have an impact in the job that they have? I would suggest that all those three areas that the church, by and large, is lacking. And so here we have an opportunity for those of us who are retired and come out of a business background to be able to influence the church, to be able to address the issues that all the people, not only in the congregation, but that should be in the congregation or could be, find of relevance. So how we identify what the needs are and how we become relevant individually as well as a church are critical issues.
Well, and I think it's also really important to recognize, Bruce, that not everybody comes out of a business background, but there's many people that come out of working for the government or working in the healthcare industry or working in military. And you live in Colorado Springs, a lot of retired military there. Or they're working in education. And most of them don't think of, well, I don't have a business background, but I got an education background or a healthcare background or a government background. But those are all relevant because they've got experience of working. And they've got experience on how to live out their faith or not live out their faith in a work environment, but even practical skills, how to interview, how to manage, how to deal with difficult employers or difficult employees. I mean, those things all come with years of experience. Bruce, how do we shift it so that retirees are relevant and are being listened to?
First of all, it all starts with identifying what are the problems that need to be solved. Jesus did that when he outlined, he said, the poor, the weak, those who are in prison, those who are sick. So identify needs. All those needs exist, but they exist in many, many different ways in categories today. So it's identifying a need and then bringing the innovative and creative energy that God puts in us through his power to take a step in solving or addressing or bringing what's the word I want? Bringing some peace and comfort. That's the word I was looking for.
Well,
bringing comfort in those areas. And so if we're not aware of those areas and we're not listening to how we are uniquely prepared to help, then in fact we will continue to be in our holy huddle and we'll look inward instead of looking outward.
Well, I think it's really important to understand, and we're going to go really into detail in that in the next couple of podcasts. How do we influence culture? But I think what's really important is for us to recognize that as, you know, I'm at the beginning age of the retirement age. I'm 55 and you're 80, so you're well into those years. So often, the culture has just shifted. It's changed so much. You know, when you were growing up, the culture was not very diverse. Today, the culture is very diverse. And what I'm seeing is that a lot of retirees are, first of all, having a hard time adjusting to a diverse culture where a lot of ethnicities are represented. I mean, I was at church yesterday. Martha and I were checking out a brand new church, and there were people from at least 20 different countries in that church. How fantastic was that? But that's very different than the churches that my parents grew up in. Also, I help a widow lady across the street, and the culture here in Fort Myers, very diverse, and she got helped by somebody of different ethnicity than what she's used to at a local hardware store that I had her go get some parts for. And she struggled with that. It was just a very different experience. How do we help retirees first to just accept the culture is where it's at so they can operate within it in order to be able to influence it?
Well, first of all, is the willingness to examine those issues and to continue to look outward and not say, well, I can't handle that, therefore all I can do is to continue to operate in a smaller world. The basic formula is to continue to be outward looking, outward focused, and outward helping. That's how our God made us, and that's what he calls on us to do. When we reject those things and say, I can't handle that, I can't do that, I won't do that, I don't know how to do that, then what the importance is then for those of us that are out to come alongside and to encourage them in that outward look and to show them how to do it. We have so many issues that are so complex, and we say, well, I can't solve that issue. No, but I can help the lady across the street.
Give an example in your life of how you've adopted to the culture so you can influence it.
Well, one is technology. The fact that I'm 80, I probably got about an 85% really good grasp of all the technologies that are available to me and that I can use. I got a 15% piece in there, but then I've identified those that can help me, and that 15%, you're one of them.
Right.
But I got 85%, and I'm open to doing it. So being open to embrace the tools that are now available that we never even thought about, 30 and 40 years ago, that you only saw on a strange movie of some kind or a strange conversation. But what we can do, the willingness to travel, the ability to get on an airplane, and the willingness to go someplace and to rent a car and to, make a hotel reservation and do all of those very basic things that before you didn't need to do because you'd never left your community. Now you have the capacity to do that. So technology is probably the biggest divider between the generations and the greatest opportunity to connect with those that God wants us to impact.
And when we get into the next podcast, we're really going to dig deep in how do we impact and how do we influence the culture, because that's something that maybe we've been pushed off to the side. We're going to push back. We got to push the walls back because our culture desperately needs us. And honestly, I'm in the middle of the culture. Bruce, our culture desperately needs all of your friends that are retired, because our culture needs, and I'm talking about specifically your Jesus following friends, because they got all this wisdom and not enough people are utilizing it. And we need to talk more about that. Bruce, thanks for being on I Retire for Him today. Thank you so much for just the impact of your testimony on so many people. Thanks for being with us today.
God bless. Look forward to the next one.
You've been listening to I Retire for Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, with your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, Retirement Reformation's own founder, Bruce Brynsma. We're Christ followers journeying from retirement to reformation, so we can ultimately say, I retire for Him.
I retire for Him.
Thanks for listening to I Retire for Him with your hosts Jim and Martha Brangenberg and Retirement Reformation founder Bruce Brynsma. I Retire for Him is the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. Most Christians tend to follow the world's pattern of rest and self-pampering during retirement. However, in your retirement, you can be focused on God's unique call to love, serve, and help others. This can be your best season of life if you take advantage of a life's worth of knowledge and experience and combine it with a greater freedom of time and money and invest it all in the generations both preceding and following you. The Retirement Reformation is encouraging Christians to find and follow God's call in all seasons and aspects of life, especially in retirement. Take time to sign the manifesto at retirementreformation.org and explore the wealth of resources available on our site. Join this movement of God and journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Go to retirementreformation.org.